a full.
We have a full quorum. Yeah.
All right, very exciting. We're getting this started right away, but we're gonna just wait just a couple minutes in case our workshop people are getting off from work and all that fun stuff.
Director Villaseñor, your background reminds me of my mother's classroom. She taught first, second, third in different combinations, so looks very familiar.
Well, it just so happens this last year I have been my kindergartner's pandemic teacher here. Hence the background. But good news is she's heading back to school 4 out of 5 days a week now instead of 2. What's been the last, I think since October, she's been going 2 days a week. So
Yeah,
it's good for everyone.
Nice.
Yeah.
finally.
Yes.
Yeah, it's been a year of teacher appreciation.
It has. Oh boy, absolutely.
Heck of a beard guy. I think I'm looking in a mirror.
I guess that's a compliment, right?
Well, let's hope so.
Well, all right, it is 5:01. Welcome everyone to our Fillmore Piru Groundwater Sustainable Agency meeting. My name is Kelly Long. I'm a supervisor and also chair of this committee. I will call this meeting to order and we will start with a pledge of allegiance. Director McFadden, if you could lead us on the pledge of allegiance.
Okay, please join me in the pledge, hand over heart, and the flags behind Kelly. I pledge allegiance to the
To the
flag
flag of the United States of America,
And
to
to
the
republic
for which
which it stands,
one
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 nation,
nation,
under
under God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. And next will be the director's roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Here.
Chair Long,
Here.
Vice Chair McFadden,
here.
Director Minigan,
Here.
Director Pace,
Here.
Director Villaseñor.
Here.
Perfect.
Wonderful. We have all of our directors in attendance today for our special board meeting. Any public comments have we received? Not on the agenda item, but any public comments? In hearing none, motion to approve the agenda. Is there any modifications to this before I ask for a motion?
Chair Long, there are no modifications recommended.
Okay, with that, if I can get a motion to approve.
So moved.
So moved.
Okay, I
Second.
will take Director McFadden as a first and then Director Villaseñor as a second. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
Thank you very much. That motion is approved. And we will now move into our stakeholder workshop. First of all, I would like to just say thank you to everyone for tuning in to today. We are going to have some really good information shared, both informational and very technical at some levels. So appreciate your questions and comments as we go through. I'm going to hand it off to our very own Lisa Ballin is to start off our workshop. She is here to assist and lead us on. So thank you, Lisa.
Super. Good evening, everybody. First on the agenda is to receive additional comments on the groundwater dependent ecosystems memo. We had a very thorough, great presentation from Christian Broderick from Stillwell Science, who's on that during the last meeting. And we received some initial comments and had discussions, but given the date that that was released, we are kind of opening that up again for additional comments tonight. There were some late letters that were received that are on the agency's website. If anybody's interested in looking at those, they are on the under the GSP tab under comments and letters. They're available there to review. So with that, we're not going to repeat the presentation since we had it. We're really just going to open it up for any comments and discussions about that memo.
Thank you. And also, if we could just reiterate, at our last board meeting, we had a great presentation on the GDEs. And then we also had another presentation at the Santa Clara River watershed. And we've had the presentation on our website for everyone to view since it was released. So we're really wanting to engage in our stakeholders. We have those who have written that technical memo here to answer questions for you. And so if we can just either raise your hand or put it in the chat, your question, so that we can answer any questions.
Chair Long, I have one question just to start with. When I checked the website early in the afternoon, the only letter I saw was from Department of Fish and Wildlife. Were there additional letters and comments added later in the day?
Director McFadden, there was, in addition to the CDFW comment letter that you saw earlier, Dan Detmer provided some comments to the authors of the tech memo on behalf of United's groundwater group. And then a little bit later, we received a, not a comment letter, but from TNC, we received a PDF of the GDE tech memo with the sticky notes and comments in Adobe format. So you'd have to scroll through there using Adobe to see those, but I'm sure the authors of the tech memo will appreciate those. And we also received from Friends of the Santa Clara River a comment letter. So I believe that that our clerk is going to distribute those if she hasn't already via email, and those are all posted on the website. Obviously, those some of those were a little bit late for any of us to review. I guess I would say I'm hopeful that the authors of those, our representatives, could verbally point out some of the more important points, and keeping in mind that we are maybe two different kinds of points I would ask for. One would be if there are things that need to be studied in the future. I think that would be very helpful. As the board is aware and many of the stakeholders, we do have a data gaps analysis, and this agency is working to try to construct some additional monitoring wells to gather additional data on the shallow groundwater's effects on the GDE areas. And so we will be bringing back an update on that monitoring wells project. But if you do have any comments on studies, we would appreciate those so they could be considered. And in particular, I think I would just urge all, given that we have a short timeline, to provide comments that are going to feed into our setting of our sustainable management criteria, and are going to help us to get closer to something like the SMC matrix that we've been looking at the past few weeks. That will be the most helpful to focus the comments on, alternatives to those minimum thresholds and objectives that are in that one. So, but we appreciate any comments, but especially those that are going to help us get our job done in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. I also want to mention that this technical memo will be part of the actual draft GSPs that will also undergo public review once the whole document is put together. So there will be another opportunity later for further comments. We're presenting these early just to get some early comments that, as Tony mentioned, will kind of feed into the analysis. So we're trying to get some early comments, but it's not the last opportunity for comments.
Can I get a clarification on our stakeholder tech memos? And maybe Tony Morgan can help. The last date we should be getting information should be the 15th or the 13th of April. I just want to make sure we're clear with all of our stakeholders so that we can really make sure we answer everyone's questions before we have to finalize the sustainable management criteria matrix.
I don't think there's necessarily a hard drop date on those. I would like to have comments, let's say by the end of the month, end of April, so we can. Now, obviously, some of those tech memos and other documents are not yet available. So obviously you can't make comments on things you don't have yet. But of those that are available, if we could have those comments by the end of the month, that it does allow us a bit of time to scan them, get the flavor for them, and see what we can do to address those appropriate comments in the draft. So we don't have to address them later. Let's take care of it now if we can.
Of course, Chair Long, the board's going to need time to digest and discuss and talk about everything too.
Exactly. So I wanted to make sure we're talking about that and setting the expectations for all. So are there anyone who submitted letters have any questions or review of the tech memo that you would like to talk about right now? We're really trying to open it up for stakeholder engagement. Okay, EJ has his hand up.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You're able to hear me, great. I didn't want you to go without at least one comment. I'm not the author, but one of my colleagues authored the comments that that Tony mentioned with the sticky notes and so forth in the PDF. And since Tony asked kind of, it didn't sound like maybe he had a chance to go through it completely. I think the two main things that we're concerned about there are the GDEs around the Cienega area in particular, and that we have objectives that bring the water levels to pre-drought levels, and that's important because we had such a huge die-off of groundwater dependent ecosystems there. And if we have objectives with lower water levels, it's going to make those more vulnerable, and it'll take longer for them to recover, which is bad from our point of view because we lose the habitat, but it's also a very bad thing because it allows non-natives like tamarix and arundo to take over with their very, very high ET rate. So that was kind of a key comment of ours is that these GDEs really need to have objectives that have water levels at pre-drought elevations. And the other thing was kind of more of a question. You know, when you're reviewing, and when Stillwater reviewed, and they did a really nice job. When they're reviewing the rooting depth versus the water levels, it's really important to make sure that there's some interpolation of the surface level. You know, the surface level at the GDE may be much lower or somewhat lower than the nearest well that's used to determine the groundwater level to see if the water levels are reaching the rooting depths of the groundwater dependent ecosystem. So those are the two main comments, but I hope the consultants will have a chance to go through all of them. Thank you very much for letting me comment.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat box from Debbie Jackson. She would like to hear a summary of environmental concerns. Debbie, I wonder if you could clarify that a little bit. Do you mean concerns from the environmental community about the GDE memo, or
Yes.
environmental concerns in the basin? Oh, the former.
Yes, the former.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. I'm not sure if anybody's had a chance to go through all the letters yet. Director Menigan, did you want to?
I think
Hello?
I have. I just haven't done the United letter. And to echo on EJ's comments, the CDFW letter is also asking for a pre-drought baseline. They also, as Steve Slack mentioned in our previous meeting on the 18th, they've had indications of routing depths deeper than 30 feet to groundwater. And so they're concerned that that might rule out some GDEs that might still be in existence within our basins. And they also noted a concern about effluent discharge from Los Angeles County from the wastewater treatment works upstream, and how that is a significant input for GDEs downstream in our basins, and that we need to monitor that. And then there was a recommendation around remote sensing and shallow groundwater wells, and particularly pairing that with stream gauge data. That was to better assess the interconnectedness of surface water and groundwater. So I think that kind of summarizes CDFW's and echoes some of TNC's concerns. Then moving on to Friends of the Santa Clara River, we also reiterated some of the comments from Melissa Rhodey at the Nature Conservancy. We added on that it's not just about the upstream releases from Santa Clarita, but it's also about bypass flows at Pyramid Dam. And when we are developing MOUs and interbasin agreements, that we need to set timelines or clear criteria around whether or not there are any foreseen changes in the future. Right now, Tony Emmert's communicated to the board that there aren't any projected changes in water use and input into the basin. But if that needs to change, we obviously need to know sooner rather than later, and that needs to be memorialized in our agreements. We also reiterated the need for a pre-drought baseline, especially with regards to documented and projected mega droughts and the potential for longer droughts. And so we're also asking for the average of a 2011 hydrographia and what that was in the shallowest aquifer to support GDEs. And then I think the other biggest thing outside of these collective comments is the fact that the Santa Clara River watershed is considered the salmonid stronghold for the federally endangered Southern California steelhead, and that we have critical steelhead habitat within our basins, and how to adequately assess limiting factors on steelhead in our basins as a result of operations within the basins. And we point to recovery actions in the National Marine Fisheries Service Recovery Plan. But we're also saying right now, a lot of the GDEs are identified as vegetative communities, and we need to have sustainable management criteria for aquatic species. And pointing to the fact that if we have the flow requirements for steelhead, we'll probably meet the requirements for a lot of other listed groundwater dependent ecosystems in the system. So Keller did a study in 2006, and they actually have a minimum flow recommendation. We do also caution using minimum flow recommendations just because minimum flows don't necessarily meet the requirements for the whole full life history and requirements of steelhead. But we point to the National Fisheries Services envelope method, which identifies some variables and natural criteria that could be extrapolated into minimum thresholds or metrics for minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. Yeah, I think that that said, the only other point that I would want to highlight is the Nature Conservancy. We've been following their framework. They also have their critical species lookbook. And when it comes to southern steelhead, they specifically say, you know, it's too unique and you need to coordinate with National Marine Fisheries Service. And as much as I've sent the tech memo to National Marine Fisheries Service for comment, as mentioned in our previous meeting, you know, 2 weeks is maybe not sufficient for a resource agency, considering they are commenting on multiple GSPs across the state. And so I will resend this to National Marine Fisheries Service stating we'd like comment by the end of April. But I think it might even be better if it came formally from the GSA rather than from me, so that we are formally requesting their input. Considering that they are the regulatory agency for the species, you know, we can provide comment as Friends of the Santa Clara River. Caltrot can provide comment as the chair of the Santa Clara River Steelhead Coalition, but ultimately NIMS has the final say, and we should really be actively pursuing their input at these junctures. And that would be my recommendation. That said, I have provided input in the letter from Friends of the Santa Clara River to keep the conversation going at this point with regards to sustainable management criteria.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat box from Carol Forna. All the work on GDEs seems to suggest that there is significant interconnection between the surface and groundwater systems. This being the case, DWR will likely expect them to be monitoring and measuring ISW using SMC. In the preparation of the critically overdraft GSPs, DWR placed heavy emphasis on this monitoring component. From their perspective, if the condition changes, even if it does so due to natural conditions, the GSA has to keep an eye on it. There is a significant risk that failing to address one of the sustainability indicators that they've identified as existing in the subbasin could cause their plan to be deemed inadequate or incomplete.
And I would
Anybody else have?
that I think the Department of Fish and Wildlife asked for the shallow groundwater monitoring wells and the stream gauge data. I think that's clearly being identified now as a data gap that, and whether or not we can address that in the short term for our January deadline, or whether or not that needs to be identified as a data gap that gets developed for our 5-year update. But we need to obviously address the monitoring requirements that are needed, either through the SMCs now or through study development that answers those questions around monitoring needs.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on that GDE tech memo?
Lisa, if I could ask more or less indirectly of those that are here, are there technical studies that quantify the groundwater use or the water use of Arundo? Are there like technical or peer-reviewed studies that, because we hear that, but it's a bamboo, and typically bamboos, or it's like a bamboo. I'm not a botanist, but typically they don't use a huge amount of water. So
Gordon, the UC Santa Barbara, they have a riparian invasion research laboratory, and through their UC Brain School, they a couple of years ago, a group of 5 master's students did a group project, particularly looking at Arundo Donax on the Santa Clara River, and they quantified, the evapotranspiration rates, the interplay of Arundo with fire and flooding, and the cost of it to infrastructure managers, and also the cost around restoration and removing it. And so they've quantified evapotranspiration rates. And I've shared that data with Fox Canyon GMA, because I'm friends with Santa Clara River, sitting on that stakeholder group as well. That can also guide project development, but it definitely has been shown to evapotranspirate more than native vegetation. There is a bit of conflict about how much that is. Some folks are saying it's overestimated, and I know that UC Santa Barbara is also doing further analysis to refine those numbers. But there's also, the Nature Conservancy, Friends of the Santa Clara River, the Santa Clara River Conservancy, CalTrout, are all working on Arundo removal projects. And, the expertise and the anecdotal information from the ground definitely shows an impact that it's having on the habitat. And that's why we've pursued multiple grants through the Integrated Regional Water Management Program with the county overseas, and those are currently underway. There's also funding through Caltrain and Wildlife Conservation Board to do Arundo removal because of the impact that it's having on water resources and natural resources.
thank you.
And I'm happy to share that information.
That would be good, because maybe I'm a pessimist. I guess it comes with being a farmer, but as I asked Christian and Bruce last time, is it realistic that we will be able to eradicate Arundo, or is it just going to be a part of the ecosystem going forward? So I'd be interested in that study.
Well, Gordon, what I can say is when I brought CalTrout's Arundo removal project to the IRWM program for funding a couple of years ago, we indicated the need for the upper and the lower watersheds to work collectively. And Laura Meek has been driving an effort for there to be a comprehensive Arundo removal strategy for the watershed, because there is a concern that upper watershed Arundo is moving downstream and reinfesting. But as a collective on the lower Santa Clara River, we've focused on this area between the Fillmore Hatchery and Santa Paula, and including the Hanson node with the Nature Conservancy just downstream of Santa Paula, because of the natural resources and critical habitat and important habitat that's within this stretch of the main stem. And so, there is Arundo in McGrath State Park, but that has to be overseen by state parks, obviously. But there is, like, the whole point of the CalTrout study was to look at the TNC, Friends of Santa Clara River County properties, and prioritize where to go with available funding. And Stillwater actually did the study to remap that vegetation, I think it was 2018. And so that's guiding that strategy for the lower watershed. That said, I've worked on nature reserves where we have eradicated non-native species, and it becomes a maintenance thing. And there's an Arundel-free watershed initiative on the Ventura River. Obviously, like, it is ongoing, because when you have a fire incident, then it comes roaring back and you have to adaptively manage that as well. And we've worked with the Nature Conservancy when Laura Riga was still the project director at the Nature Conservancy on a task team to proactively manage after fire so that you get on top of it before it becomes a problem through reinfestation. So I think they are the holistic watershed wide efforts. I think the Wildlife Conservation Board and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and other resource agencies are all recognizing the threat that it has. I mean, the fact that it got funded by Department of Water Resources indicates that, and by all these multiple resource agencies, the importance of removing it. And I think the more and more data that becomes available will show, you know, that it does have a positive impact on water resources when it's removed. So it is definitely a priority project that we'd want to be looking at as a board moving forward. And EJ has also shared TNC's Arundel evapotranspiration document in the chat for those who want it.
Along with that line, Tony Morgan, I am wondering, with the information and classifying it as an invasive plant, do we put that in our plan to continue to work with our partners to eradicate that? You can't do it just in 1 year. So is that a goal? Because we know all the seeds, everything goes downstream, but is that something that we can write into our plan to be working with our partners in the state to eradicate that?
Clearly you can. There's opportunity under the project and management actions section in the GSP. And so this could be one of those things that the board adopts as an action that they want to pursue.
Thank you.
And if I may, there were a couple Wildlife Conservation Board pre-proposals submitted yesterday that address more local projects on arundel removal and riparian restoration. But there's also this longer, bigger picture effort that's currently underway, spearheaded initially by Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency and other partners, including UCSB and Stillwater, and hopefully soon to be a much broader array of partnerships to try to see if we might actually be able to write the Santa Clara River watershed-wide arundel management removal program for the full watershed into Senate Bill 45 for the 2022 bond. So that, just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. It's not guaranteed, but I think there's a good shot at least of making a good case for that.
Thank you. We have another comment in the chat box from Kat Film. In addition to steelhead, these GDEs act as a critical area for breeding of many migratory songbird species. TNC has been conducting bird point counts on the river since 2011, and the results of last year are evidence of the importance of these GDEs. Despite the recovery from the 5-year drought in the last 2 wet years, species richness continued to decline on most properties from 2011 levels. It is likely that the loss of mature tree cover on the wettest properties, which was substantial by 2016, 2017, coupled with increased cover of arundo on most properties since the last large scouring event in 2011, are keeping bird species richness and abundance depressed. Densities of 3 special status species remain high on one of our properties, and that is one where arundo has been removed and the riparian forest did not experience any die-off from the last major drought. Thank you for that. And as Director Mennigan mentioned, there's a resource in the chat box from EJ Remsen, thank you, having to do with arundo water consumption. And then Kat is qualifying that the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology has been doing these surveys for TNC. Thank you.
Bruce or Christian, can I ask you a question on the study that you did? We've had fires for the last 4 years. And how does that put a play into, I'm hearing trees, well, we've had a lot of trees burn. And a lot of species have to move to get out of fire and so forth. How does this play on the pressure from, just everything moving down from the hills into the river where it was more safe?
Well, there's definitely, obviously increased concern over or fire risk and fires in the riparian zone. And that this definitely clearly relates back to the Arundo issue as well. So, the non-native invasive Arundo creates a good fuel load that can, transmit fires through the riparian zone, and then creates a positive feedback loop where, especially if you're getting the fires in the summer or fall, it will tend to, kill or significantly impact the native vegetation. But Arundo Donax responds very quickly post-fire, given the higher nutrient loads that are actually added to the system through the ash. And so say in the fall, it can start regrowing at, an inch or more per day. And it may be months. A lot of the native vegetation recovery, if the trees, the willows and cottonwoods, for example, are completely killed, they won't be able to come back until at the earliest the following spring, when conditions are suitable for establishing seedlings, and that requires local seed source to be present. So it's a key issue related to managing all the riparian systems in the river, including the GDE units. So we could talk more about that, and there is, I guess related to that, the fire risks with Arundo and drought conditions would exacerbate that, because native or non-native vegetation would have lower moisture content and presumably, increased flammability if a fire does get started. So it's not an easy issue to address, but it's a critical part of sort of the larger strategic planning that's going on in the watershed by all the partners, the ones Candace has talked about and others as well. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but I could elaborate more if I'm missing something.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I just think it's important that we talk about what's going on in the environment as we're making these decisions.
One thing I should note that I was actually out in the field at the Cienega site last week with Linnea Hall from the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology. And surprisingly, the bird list for that site has a greater number of species, 125 species they've documented, which actually is about a dozen more than what they've been finding down at Hedrick Ranch Nature Area. So it's very important for migratory birds as well as some residents, and provides a unique resource, and that highlights the value of the current restoration planning effort that is underway for that site with CDFW.
Thank you. We have another comment in the chat box from Logan Hardison. The Stillwater report dropped a basket of information on us just a week ago. It seems the board is being asked to make decisions regarding GDEs today, considering a raft of could be, might be conditions. Further, one flood can wipe out a substantial amount of ecosystems we devote substantial effort and water to conserve beforehand. At this time, it seems appropriate to monitor and further study potential conditions, rather than locking in requirements that may not be needed in the actual future. And then Debbie Jackson is agreeing with that.
Well, I mean, I think what I'd say is DWR has tasked us to identify the existing GDEs. So as much as that can change, we still need to, as a board, develop sustainable management criteria for what is existing. We do, however, have to adaptively manage based on whether or not we have a fire or a flood event. But the sustainable management criteria and the measurable objectives are meant to to guide that management and those management decisions and provide triggers which require management action. So it's less about you know, the conditions potentially changing. They will change. We also know what they are meant to change towards in an ideal situation, but we obviously don't manage and operate in a vacuum.
No, but we do have the guiding principles for our Fillmore Piru Groundwater Sustainable Agency. And so everyone, I think, should review that. We are to look at the GDEs for potential issues and be able to understand those. And that's what part of my understanding is this technical memo is giving us is a guiding document. Tony Morgan, as far as the GWR is requesting of our GSAs, if you could elaborate a little bit more so that people who aren't in this on a daily basis will know.
Well, GDEs are not one of the sustainable management criteria, but they're related to the surface and groundwater interaction criteria, as well as groundwater elevation. So they're one of the beneficial uses and users of groundwater. And so they are something that we have to take into consideration when we develop the sustainable management criteria, when we set MTs and MOs in there. They aren't the sustainable management criteria, but they are one of the factors that we have to take into consideration.
Thank you. I'm wondering if perhaps this might be a good time to transition to Tony's presentation on the current draft of the sustainable management criteria, if nobody has any more questions on the actual tech memo.
I would just state that the Friends letter also calls for a steelhead limiting factors analysis. Tony Emmert had asked for me to highlight whatever studies are being requested. And that would be an additional data gap. Right now, the recovery plan is a little bit coarse to address the fine scale surface water, groundwater interactions.
Thank you. And there's one last comment, I guess, before we get into Tony's presentation from Helen McGrath. She agrees with Logan. I have attended many of these meetings, and there is more speculation than actual concrete metrics. It is not appropriate to adapt strict guidelines, but proceed as Logan suggests. There are enough overlapping goals amongst ag, municipal, and environmental stakeholders to focus on now. And then Director McFadden.
A quick question for Tony Morgan. Tony, just can you review the requirements of BWR as far as our baseline year, where we have to be aware of conditions and not let it get worse than those conditions?
Yeah, so it backs up to January 2015 when the act became effective. That's your baseline year. You don't have to go back and try to recreate conditions before the January 2015 date. You can if you want, but you're not statutorily required to in the regulations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to plan for how long? It's a 20-year plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have 20 years to get to sustainability, and then they want to see that you can maintain that for another 30 years. So you're looking at basically a 50-year window that they're concerned with. They, being DWR, are concerned with.
I would just add that while DWR doesn't require you to go beyond 2015 baseline, multiple environmental stakeholders have noted the need to go to 2011 or pre-drought because of the impacts that GDEs had during the drought. And so that is definitely something we as the environmental community are asking this board to consider to go prior to 2015.
I just want to make sure that we understand what the requirements are and that we're not going beyond the scope of the law.
Thank you. Tony, you ready for your presentation?
Sure. All right, you should see a slide pop up.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm looking around here at multiple screens, so I'm not ignoring you. I'm just getting things situated so I can see people. Okay, this evening's session on sustainable management criteria will be essentially a continuation of the conversation started at the last board meeting. This session is designed to maximize the time available for stakeholder input on the draft sustainable management criteria. Many of you will recognize some of the slides we have here, and you've participated in the conversations at recent board meetings, previous stakeholder workshops, maybe even the ad hoc committee discussions. This evening's presentation assumes that everyone has participated in these events or has taken the opportunity to review the recordings that are on the agency's website. So we're going to take a brief look at the draft SMC matrix so everybody understands what we're trying to create. This matrix contains recent input offered by the board of directors and stakeholders at the last board meeting. We don't intend to rehash the rationale that has gotten us to this point, although I do have information slides available if we need to reference them during our discussions. Our goal is to settle on a set of SMCs that will be used in the draft GSP document. Stakeholders and directors will have the opportunity to comment on the draft GSP, of course, but as you've heard earlier, the SMCs are such a fundamental part of the GSP. We prefer to have stakeholder input earlier in the process before composing the GSP. It just makes a whole lot more sense in the overall process. So on the screen popping up there is the sustainability criteria matrix. It includes the language as established at the last board meeting. You see it's stamped draft, do not cite a reference. All these are draft documents. The requested updates at the last meeting were primarily associated with groundwater storage and land subsidence. And you'll see they have an asterisk right here, and here. And so the general organization as it is your indicator, sustainability indicator is down on the left. We come across in the next column to say, what are the undesirable results we're trying to avoid? What's the metric we propose to do that evaluation? What's our minimum threshold, that level below which we don't want to see things get to? What's our MO, our measurable objective? That's, I always think measurable objective is kind of an odd way to word it. I think it's your future desired conditions. We'd like to have water levels at the 2011 high, for example, here. And then comments just has some comments in there about providing a little bit extra clarification on something in a particular row. And so I thought before we jump into this, because there are some names on here I don't remember seeing at some of the other meetings, is let's do a quick summary of the SMC's general framework. So what's our goal? We're trying to minimize unreasonable impacts to users and uses of groundwater. So that's domestic users, municipal, irrigation, environmental, recreational, et cetera. All those things that DWR has identified for us. We also are trying to avoid significant and unreasonable impacts. Who gets to define them? Well, the directors have the honored position of being able to define the definition of significant and unreasonable with input from stakeholders. And that's part of the process this evening, okay? As we just mentioned, January 2015 is your statutory baseline. You're not obligated to restore, recreate, or improve conditions prior to that, but you are free to do so if you like. And the goal is to obtain sustainability by 2042, so 20 years into the future after filing our plan. So what do we know so far based on all of the analyses and the conversations we've had? As far as the lowering of groundwater levels, there's no chronic decline in water levels. None of the wells are expected to go dry during future climate change scenarios. We're pumping regimes. There's no chronic decline in groundwater storage expected into the future. Seawater intrusion is a not applicable issue. We're too far from coast to have that be a problem. Degraded water quality is an interesting one and a bit of an odd duck, but the agency, the GSA, has no regulatory authority over water quality. So we're going to work with the water quality authorities that do have that regulatory issue. So we'll continue the monitoring and water quality tabulations that are currently ongoing. But if a significant issue is identified, then the agency will work with the agency that does have the regulatory authority to do something. Continuing on, land subsidence. It's not been reported during the historical past. It's not anticipated during the future climate and groundwater pumping conditions. Okay. Surface water depletion, a little more information here because I know it's a big topic of interest for this evening. In areas of the rising groundwater, the impacts of groundwater extraction near the Santa Clara and the river, so 2020 forward in time, are not materially greater than the historical period. The median change is about 1 CFS. Okay. In severe multi-decadal droughts, multi-month periods with zero rising groundwater, whether you have with or without pumping, occur, and groundwater levels can fall below the critical water level that we talked about last month for vegetation purposes. In droughts of the more typical duration, the 3 to 5 year droughts, I hate to say it, but the routine droughts, there are periods with zero rising groundwater at the GDE areas with or without pumping, okay? But there are fewer than those of the multi-decadal droughts. The GDEs and the fish hatchery and Willard Road are somewhat transient in nature. They're subject to droughts and flooding and scouring associated with that. So there's a life cycle and a regenerative process associated with that. We've heard those kind of conversations last month and tonight again as well. It's good information there. One thing that when we turned off the pumping to determine the effects pumping might have on water levels at the GDE areas, okay, we turned it off in the groundwater flow model. And that is a very severe reduction in pumping. It was over 30,000 acre feet of pumping. That's roughly a 50% increase to see those levels. So that's a pretty healthy bite at the apple to talk about. But I just wanted to make sure everybody understood what that meant. So let's go back to our matrix now. We've kind of set the general framework there. And then Lisa, how would you like to go through these? You want to go them in order or let people comment and pick which ones they'd like to jump into? I've got you see the little arrows boxes here that allows me to jump to the slides that deal with that particular topic if we need to have something to speak to along the way.
I think I'm open to suggestions, but I think it keeps the conversation organized if we take one at a time. And I know that there is some interrelationship, but Chair Long, do you have an opinion on how you'd like this conversation to go?
No, I agree with you.
Okay. So let's just start from the top this time, unless somebody wants to go in a different order. Let's open it up for groundwater elevation. I think when we brought this up last time, we didn't really get a lot of comments on these criteria at the last meeting. So, and I don't believe these were changed since the last time.
Correct.
So.
Correct.
Okay, I'm not seeing any. I'm not seeing any hand raised or comments in the chat box, but let's move to the next one, and we can certainly go back if something comes up afterwards. Okay, super. Okay, groundwater storage reduction. This one was revised since last time to match the groundwater elevation. Any comments on this one?
I just have a comment. I know Director Menahem had brought up in the last meeting regarding the models and the time period for potential drought, and the model that you did, Tony, of a potentially longer time. Was there anything in the meantime was done to look at a longer drought period model?
Well, what we can do, let me see if I can quickly get to those slides. Here we go. So if we look at this slide, which we've seen before, we've got precipitation plotted here. That's the blue bars, the vertical blue bars. Okay, and I'm looking at the Piru Basin just as an example. Piru Fillmore look very similar to each other. And then you see the brown line here. It goes higher and it goes lower and then it comes back up. That's the cumulative departure from mean precipitation. So the way you interpret this is when this curve is going down, that means you're getting sequential years of precipitation below the average. You're basically in a drought. Now the severity of that can vary between a little bit below the average or a whole lot below the average. Okay, but the point here is that we have a multi-decadal period here where we're in a drought in this model. And understand these beyond 2020 here, these are all synthetic. We developed those by looking at the historical precipitation record, cloned a certain piece of it and appended it onto the current period. And so we already have a period in the modeling data that shows a very long period of drought where the water levels are falling and our amount of water in storage is declining. So you can see we bottom out here at about, what is that, 2042 or something like that, and begin on a recovery period thereafter. So we already have something in the modeling scenario where we have a long drought period that we're simulating.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for pointing that out.
But Tony, ultimately, if we did 10-year droughts, would that even push it out more decades?
10-year droughts? I mean,
yeah, like this is a 7-year drought, and
this is a 7-year drought right here, right?
Will the orange line be longer? You know,
It'll probably be steeper, might be deeper in
Okay.
this. Yep.
Okay.
Tony, does this particular precipitation projection or simulation, does it include the climate change factors in the precipitation, or is this just the starting point?
No, it actually does include the climate change already. And so if you look at, for example, this period right here, and remember we said we took the historical period and we cut and pasted it and appended it on. If we look to a similar period in the future, that's this area right here. And so you can see these peaks are higher than the peaks over here. So we're showing the effect of climate change where there's forecasted to be more precipitation based on the change factors that DWR supplied. So we've already got climate change built into this one. Questions on this one?
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions or comments on this one. Oh, here's one. I apologize. From Dan Bittmer. Recall we have required 5-year updates to DWR. If we are in extended drought, the agency will react. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Thank you,
something to remind everybody is that there is a mandatory 5-year update to your plan. So you're going to revisit this every 5th year and refresh anything that needs to be refreshed. If some of the assumptions you made don't look to be appropriate anymore, well, that's your time to change. And you're going to get a sneak peek at that along the way, because in addition to the 5-year update, you're required to do an annual report to the DWR. It's a much smaller document, but you need to look at how much pumping, what did water levels do, what was precipitation doing, all those kinds of things that are relatively straightforward tabulations of basic hydrologic information. But you've got an opportunity to get a head start on your 5-year update by looking and saying, things are performing as we thought they were, or no, they're not. And when it comes time for the 5-year update, we might have to do some revisions or rethinking about how we're approaching certain topics. So nothing in here is cast in stone. You can make adjustments to it down the road to get you to the point where you're getting to a sustainable condition. Remember, one of the things that's unique about our basins here is that when there's a drought, the water levels go down. When we come out of the drought, the basins refill. And there's a pretty consistent repetitive signal we see for both the Fillmore and Piru basins. That's not necessarily the situation in other basins in California. And I think DWR's guidance documents and things are very much oriented towards those basins who are seeing their water levels fall and they never come back. Well, we're not in that situation. Our basins recover when the wet periods appear. So we're in a situation that's different than what DWR is used to be seeing. It's actually a very good position for us to be in because we can demonstrate that water levels do recover, storage does come back in our basin. We've got the historical record to support that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on groundwater storage reduction before we move to surface water depletion? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So let's open it up then for discussion about the surface water depletion criteria. And just a reminder, I think as Tony mentioned earlier, the GDE effects are relative to the surface water depletion and the groundwater elevation criteria.
Lisa and Sherlock.
Or do you, or can I go?
Go for it.
Great. I feel like I'm a little bit of a stuck record on this one, but I think one of the points we made is that a lot of the surface water depletion metrics have been, the discussion has been around rooting depth for vegetative communities and our other beneficial uses are also aquatic species like federally endangered southern steelhead, and we need a flow-related metric to capture any adverse effects to critical steelhead habitat and its ability to sustain steelhead and steelhead recovery. So like the GDE pulled out vegetation communities less than 30 feet. CDFW has indicated that it might be more than 30 feet. You know, we need a metric for vegetation communities that we can all agree on with the best available science, but we also need a metric for southern steelhead. And as indicated in our letter, if we have flows that support steelhead, those will also invariably support vegetative communities, which also host nesting bird species in the watershed. And this is where,
for not, oh.
Yeah, I think this is just where we can make recommendations, but we definitely need, as per TNC's guidance for their species lookbook, engage with NIMS for full guidance on the federally endangered species. I've provided recommendations.
Thanks, and I apologize, I haven't seen that letter because it just came out, but is there an alternate criteria that's proposed in there for a minimum threshold that we can bring up for discussion tonight?
Yeah, so a few iterations of this sustainable management criteria matrix. I did supply some information to Tony around what some of those could be. And we had discussions about whether or not that's a temperature metric or wetted channel, established wetted channel metric. One of the recommendations that I had given to Stillwater was to review the State Water Board's surface water, groundwater study for the Ventura River, because they've potentially identified metrics there. I've reviewed NIMS's comments on that as well. And that's why I'm saying, like, there might be further guidance. One of the things that I've indicated in the letter was obviously the data gap of a finer scale steelhead limiting factors analysis, and I've discussed that with Bruce and Christian. The Department of Fish and Wildlife's requirement around the shallow groundwater monitoring wells, that could be another potential metric coming out of there. As I mentioned earlier, the Keller study recommends a minimum flow. But I think, you know, you want to look at the physical and biological features that the fish relies on. And we've discussed the challenges, you know, Stillwater and I have discussed the challenges because the channel moves from a geomorphological standpoint. So it's really about unpacking and discussing the metrics and whether or not we want to have that discussion this evening. Or if we are in agreement that it is needed to rope in NIMS to have that discussion, or the Santa Clara River Steelhead Coalition.
I would like to have a question also. The river with the floods, it's ebb and flows. Sometimes the water's not there, sometimes it is. Are you trying to create a habitat that it's there always?
No, I mean, that's also one of the comments, is that the flows are required and needed at specific times. For adult steelhead and smolts out migrating, that the focus is on flow during the spring and the winter. There are places on the main stem where, because of springs, there is year-round juvenile rearing habitat potentially. One of those is the GDE on the downward end towards Santa Paula along South Mountain Road. I forget the name of that GDE right now. So no, we're not trying to keep flow in the river all year long. It's to mimic the natural hydrograph of the river. And ensure.
Okay, because I understood all of the GDE because you and I were in that seminar together, and I don't recall it being dependent on fish only. It was about a 30 feet with the water for plants and so forth. So I'm trying to understand what you're trying to design.
And that's my point, is that right now the focus is on vegetation communities, but we still do need sustainable management criteria for southern steelhead to be developed. And there is potentially over summer rearing habitat in some of the GDEs. And we also don't want the operations to impact those spring and winter migration flows.
And again, that is potential, but it's not the direction that DWR has requested for a 5-year, but it could be programs in which we're looking at for the future.
Well, if it's a data gap, we definitely have to identify that we need to go and verify if we can't answer the question. Like for example, there is the potential for steelhead habitat in that one GDE for over summer rearing, and it's about verifying that. And we know that the main stem is the migration corridor, so it's not about having to verify that. It's just about maintaining the flows at those particular times, and that's why I said like some of these sustainable management criteria aren't year-round. It's at particular times of the year and in particular parts of the basin. So there's a spatial and temporal aspect to it, which means we might have management areas for those to make sure that we aren't having a negative impact.
Well, and is there any rules or regulations already from the state on that for the river? I guess United would know that, right?
Well, there's guidance through the biological opinion for flows required from Santa Felicia Dam. And so we know what's coming down the river. It's about maintaining that through the basins.
Well, I do know that we have to look at everything just to see what potentials there are. But I'm not sure if we have to have markers for every single potential that might be there. So I think we need to figure that one out.
Chair Lon, I would offer just a little bit on that one. I would say that there's probably very little that this agency is going to do that's going to have a major impact or maybe even measurable impact on the springtime flows of the river. So during the time that that Omicus or steelhead would be migrating, it's either going to be a good year or it's not going to be because of what nature provides us. And of course, as Director Menigan noted, the Santa Felicia Dam does have migration releases that are programmed into the FERC license. So I would say that it's probably more important for this agency to focus on the potential use of the GDE areas, and it would probably be best to focus on the East Grove, Willard Road section, as Director Menigan mentioned, because that one actually does seem to, even during several year severe droughts, it does often have some flow remaining. So if that's identified as a potential spot, then the agency may want to take a little closer look at that one. The Cienega or fish hatchery one, that one, because of the gradient of the Piru Basin, severe drought just seems to kick our rears on this, and I was actually surprised to see how little effect or how little worse the pumping makes it. So the major controlling factor is nature in what happens there in the Cienega area. So it doesn't seem like that's going to be a great place for steelhead to over summer in the Cienega area, and maybe focusing on the plants is more important there, therefore the birds also. But the one on the bottom end, the East Grove, Hedrick Ranch, Willard Road one, that one does seem to stay wet through most conditions. And I don't know, Tony, if you want to go back to some of those slides on that, if you have those handy, but that's what the analysis seemed to show when we were looking at that correlation of flow to projected groundwater levels.
Sure, we can go there. This is the East Grove area. And so we're looking at two separate curves. The brown is if there's no pumping, the gray is with pumping. and your y-axis is rising groundwater. So this is your surface water flow in the vicinity of Willard Road in the Santa Clara River channel. So as we fully expect, there is some impact due to pumping, but it doesn't completely dewater the system there, even during very severe long-term drought periods. It doesn't. So that's kind of the uniqueness of that situation. And then I thought, well, since we're here, we've got this graph, which I think is an awesome illustrator. And it basically just shows you how during a drought. So here we are in 2011, and here's the continuous reaches of the river. And as time goes by, those reaches get smaller, they get more intermittent, okay, and they just continue to shrink with time. So, this gives us that idea that these things are not permanent. They do fluctuate in response to the drought. And it is the driving factor that causes most of the drying up, if you will, of the river channel.
Tony, just for clarification, so what you're
Yeah.
saying is that no matter if we do have a drought, there's still 5 CSF water that's there in the slide before. So there's no part where it would not have water.
Yes, using the information from United's model, the forward forecast, that's the 2020 from right here going forward. We're not seeing in any of the climate conditions into the future where we totally dry it out. We certainly deplete it some, but we don't totally dry it out at the Willard Road spot.
Okay. So there will always be water there based on the parameters that we've been built in.
Correct.
Thank you.
And Tony, that's the 50% reduction in pumping in the Fillmore and Piru basins that you were talking about.
Correct.
So if we turned off 50% of the water availability, that's the difference.
Correct.
And also DWR didn't put us into this classification because we are in a severe drought or we're not going to have the water. They are doing it in case there's more housing, in case there's more building and so forth. Is that correct?
That's part of it, but the leading reason we're in this category is that we're groundwater dependent. We don't have surface water supplies to rely upon. We don't have a Sacramento River running through the basins that we can draw upon for supply. We've got groundwater.
And our groundwater modeling is showing that, and this chart right here is showing us that our water will continue to be there.
Yes. And that the earlier stress tests we did when we increased the amount of pumping in the basins, we showed that the basin continued to recover during the wet periods and that kind of thing. So we have amazingly resilient basins. We've known that just anecdotally from looking at all the data over the years, but the groundwater model further replicates that same conclusion.
And then that's good for all that use the groundwater.
Oh, totally. Totally. We are the envy of several other groundwater basins.
Lisa, I've got a
Director
couple of
McFadden has been waiting. Yeah, I've been trying to get to you. Thanks. Go for it.
I remember my questions. Tony Emmert, I think you answered one of the questions that I had, and that is, isn't it true that historically, regardless of what we do in the basins, regardless of the level of the water in the basins or any pumping, United historically has maintained critical flows at critical areas as required to maintain steelhead habitat and migration paths?
Director McFadden, that's true. And the only limitation is if there's not much water in the Santa Felicia Basin, I mean, in the reservoir, because there's not much water in the Piru watershed, then there's not much we can do. And as Tony Morgan noted, there often during drought is not extra water available. So that is one thing that this board has talked about in the past is during droughts, there are possibilities of utilizing the access to the state water project and, buying some water on the water market by some kind of a transfer. That's not usually cheap during droughts. But those are things that United is trying to prepare for, is to take advantage of that water when it's available and make sure that as best we can to try to keep the groundwater levels closer to the 2011. So for example, if we have a decent year and there's water available, it might get us from a medium level all the way up to the highest level. So I think we would all agree that the more years we can be closer to 2011, the better it is for all users and uses of water. But it's easier said than done. So this agency may have a part in some of that effort.
As I recall, when Lake Piru Santa Felicia Dam was at the lowest levels I've ever seen, below 10,000 acre feet, we were still releasing between 3,000 and 7,000 gallons per minute from the base of the dam to maintain potential habitat on Piru Creek.
That's correct? That's correct. So there's a...
And the volume depended on the timing of, potential movement patterns, migration patterns.
Correct. So there's a requirement in the FERC license for a habitat release. That's a minimum of 7 cubic feet per second, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And then dependent upon several factors, that changes. So it goes between 7 and 20 CFS. That's over 5,000 acre feet a year at the minimum level that's released down Piru Creek, and a significant amount of that contributes towards recharge in the basin. And then when the conditions are met that there's sufficient water for steelhead migration, then a 200 CFS flow is released. So that's quite a bit of water, but that's usually during the winter time. So some of that, part of that contributes to recharge and part of it doesn't. But some of the needs of steelhead or just Omicus in general are met by that if there's water in the reservoir.
Okay, well, but the point I'm trying to make is historically, regardless of the conditions of the basins or where we are in a drought, United has been required to maintain certain critical habitat.
Correct.
So it has nothing to do with us. The second question I have, which I can't answer, is when I look at the, let me just ask one more question, Candace, then I'll step back. But and we're talking about potential summer habitat along the Santa Clara River. The question I would have is what I see is most of the water I see in the locations, since I live close by parts of the river and I drive past Willard regularly, although I don't see all of it, looks pretty warm and very, very covered with moss. And I would have to ask a fish person, an ichthyologist, if that is potential steelhead habitat. I've seen Omicus react very negatively when temperatures get above a certain point, the oxygen level drops. They can't survive. So is that, we're going to have to put coolers on the river to make it steelhead habitat, or it's just a question for somebody who knows, is that potential habitat due to our conditions?
So to your previous point about flows being mandated through the FERC license, I'm not in any disagreement that United is providing flows as required through that biological opinion. The point that I'm making is that as an agency, our operations mustn't impact those flows or undermine those flows in any way. And we obviously need a metric to measure that we aren't doing that within our basins. And then with regards to the over summer rearing habitat, the thought process there is that we're having consistent water because there's spring inflow and support from groundwater. And your point about water quality is something that I was going to bring up under degraded water quality, is just that on other river systems, in California, water temperature has been listed as a TMDL with the regional water quality control boards. That isn't the case on the Santa Clara River. However, that is a limiting factor on steelhead. And part of that going to see, is this habitat, are operations from pumping impacting that habitat and water temperature or whatever sustainable management criteria. That's kind of the data gap right now that we need to investigate, that our operations aren't negatively impacting water temperature and therefore steelhead habitat and recovery and sustainability in those reaches.
I think the greatest impact to water temperatures in those reaches is central Ventura County weather.
Well, I mean, I think the point is that we have to do our homework and show DWR that we have done our due diligence as an agency.
Thanks. There are a number of comments in the chat box that have been accumulating, and I'm thinking maybe I can read a bunch of them and we can kind of categorize them. They may be a little bit from earlier, in reaction to some earlier statements, but I'll read through them and then we'll see if we can kind of address, each point. Dan Dittmer commented that he disagrees about the specific objectives of SGMA do not include steelhead recovery. Please don't confuse natural seasonal stream flow for migration with minor flows associated with rising groundwater. And then from Brian Bondi, maybe Bruce can clarify, are the steelhead spawning and or rearing in the rising groundwater areas, or is that an area needed for passage? From Helen McGrath, why is this the first time steelhead has been mentioned? They're not a groundwater dependent species, are they? From Brian, rising groundwater is a small part of the flows when there is flow continuity for passage. From Katie Brokaw, it seems strange to bring in steelhead to me. I haven't heard this brought up in any of the prior meetings. Debbie Jackson, I admit it, I'm confused. If the SMC is surface water depletion, then shouldn't we be looking at how groundwater pumping affects surface water depletion? And hasn't Tony demonstrated that there isn't much of a correlation? Katie Brokaw agreed with that. And then I think this last one is, I'll get to that in a minute, because I think this group kind of can be categorized in three areas. Number one is kind of clarifying the extent to which, steelhead habitat is present and for what uses. And then I see also a question about what is the responsibility or objective under SGMA, relative to that. And then, we can get into the criteria, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Bruce or Christian might be able to help us with some of these questions about the steelhead, resources and, in the basin, so we can kind of get that set, and then we can talk about what the SGMA requirements are.
Before
relative to that.
Christian jump in, I'm just gonna say, we have, under the regulations from National Marine Fisheries Service, we have designated Southern California steelhead critical habitat within our basins. So it's not a matter of are they there? The habitat is designated from the regulatory agency. So you have to protect the habitat for migration, for rearing, for all the life cycle history parts for the species. That said, we've been trying to do monitoring for the species on the watershed for multiple years now, and there has not been funding forthcoming to do that. So a lot of the steelhead sightings have been anecdotal, and what's moved through the Vern Freeman diversion and what's been seen in the upper reaches within the Los Padres National Forest. The species is definitely active and present on the watershed. And our duty under the Endangered Species Act and under the Public Trust Doctrine is to not have a negative impact on the species. So as much as, and these are discussions we've had as an agency in previous meetings, as much as SGMA requires of us to write a groundwater sustainability plan, southern steelhead are identified as a beneficial user of groundwater because they are a groundwater dependent ecosystem. Bill Trush actually dubbed the southern steelhead the groundwater steelhead because of the link between surface water and groundwater in the natural hydrograph. So there is a distinct connection to groundwater dependence for the species regionally.
But Candace, is that in all their life stages, both when they're migrating and not migrating, or is that primarily in the spawning areas?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Ed.
In areas where I've seen trout spawning and other species spawning, headwaters of rivers, spring areas, the species, the hatchlings are dependent on not just the flowing water in the river, but water that's down in the gravel. So I could see how they would be dependent on groundwater in spawning areas. The question is any part of the Santa Clara River within the basin's potential, could it possibly be a spawning area just because of the conditions during those critical times?
Well, we definitely know that, that there was a 2005 Southern Steelhead Opportunities document done, I believe it was by Matt Stecker and Elise Kelly. And they identified steelhead habitat for rearing and spawning. So that, I mean, it's outdated, but that habitat has been identified. And Pirate Creek.
Is that within basins?
Yeah. So it's Sespe and Piru are key tributaries.
But are the spawning areas within the basins, or are they within the tributaries above the basins?
Well, I mean, this is the fact that we need life cycle monitoring on the watershed. We don't have the data. It's a data gap. But that said, it's irrespective of whether or not they're spawning. National Marine Fisheries Service has designated the main stem as critical steelhead habitat. Whether or not that's for migration or rearing is irrespective. It's designated.
Yes, and the point that I was making earlier is that regardless of what we do as an agency, historically, United has maintained flows during critical times. So we won't have any control over that. That will happen without us.
It's not about we don't have control. It's that our actions must not negatively impact those flows. It's not about dictating to United. It's just ensuring that our activities as an agency aren't impacting these flows.
What actions as an agency would we have that could impact United's flows?
Well, any of our projects could impact the flows, or our inaction on projects could impact those flows.
Candace, I guess my concern kind of mirrors what I've said from the start as we form this agency. I want to be very careful that we comply with SGMA, that we comply with the letter of the law, and that we don't go beyond what we need to do. I think that's unfair. I think that's an unfair ask to the assessment payers. So we need to be very careful.
Ed, I don't think we're disagreeing. I think it's just that we have to comply with SGMA, but as a public agency, we also have to comply with public trust resources doctrine and the Endangered Species Act. And it's not about overreaching or doing anything that we don't need to do. It's having the sustainable management criteria in place to show that we are not having a negative impact on groundwater dependent ecosystems and beneficial uses such as steelhead. But we need a sustainable management criteria and minimum thresholds and measurable objectives to show that we aren't having those impacts. Without them, we cannot show that we're not having an impact.
If I can ask a question, is there something that we could do, Director Menahem, to get this data gap that you're mentioning and have that somehow as an asterisk as part of the SMC of looking at data, if we can't come up with that with the MT right now? Is that what you're saying, that there's not enough information and more information is needed?
No, I'm not saying that I think in some instances there isn't enough information. In other instances, it's just us having the discussion about what that metric is and agreeing on what that metric is so that we set it so we can monitor accordingly.
Lisa, I've got Lisa and Chair Long a suggestion. Obviously, we have a lot to discuss and a lot of things to read and review with regards to surface water depletion. Many of the documents were not available when I was looking earlier today. So we're going to need more time, more meetings to look at that. Would it be beneficial to focus right now on the 5 SMCs that we're in more agreement on?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to also mention that we're kind of in the workshop portion of tonight's meeting, and then we've got a motion item following this where the board can, deliberate on the criteria. The board can decide which ones to approve, maybe some and not all. But I do agree that it's probably a good idea to get all the comments in for you on the surface water depletion and GDE so that you have them at least, and then we can move on to the other topics, if that sounds good to you, Chair Long.
I think so. I think we're just kind of going back and forth at this point, and we need to be getting some more information.
I'll mute myself and listen.
Great.
No, you're good. This is what the workshop's for. And I have to say that because we have a lot of people chatting on here as well and not speaking up about this, but having similar feelings. And we have many different stakeholders in this, and it's important for us to be talking about this and where we're going. So you know me, do not hold back. We do need to talk.
Well, I don't want to take up space where stakeholders who've come here specifically to give input are displaced by my comments. So there'll be plenty of time for us to deliberate as a board. I'd like to hear what the stakeholders have to say.
Okay, great. I'll get back to reading some of their comments, but to echo Chair Long's comments, it's a workshop meant to be a robust conversation where we get a lot of input, but also have a lot of back and forth and conversation so we can really make some progress kind of in an informal manner. So all of the discussion and back and forth is really helpful. So appreciate all the input from both the board and the stakeholders. But I'll get back to the chat box so that I can make sure that everybody hears the comments that we did get. From Matt Freeman, and this is going back to why the basin falls under the Sigma criteria. Please refresh my memory, but didn't DWR place our basins as impaired primarily because we don't have any other additional sources of water than rain? Therefore, building on what Tony just spoke about, I believe our basins are not impaired, but follow California's wet and dry cycles, and trying to assume that dry periods will be more prolonged is not an acceptable assumption. We could just as easily enter a prolonged wet cycle beginning next year. The reality is no one knows the future until it happens, and then it becomes history. We cannot risk everything on hypothetical potentials, but use the current modeling as proposed and then make adjustments every 5 years if needed. The GDEs are larger than ever because of additional water from LA County and continuous releases from the Santa Felicia Dam. And then Dan Detmer commented that 2005 was record a wet year. And Katie Brokaw.
I'm going to interject something. 2005 was also, I'd like to say destruction of habitat on the river, but maybe radical adjustment of habitat, unlike any I've seen since for decades. More riparian habitat was displaced and swept out to sea than I think any drought has ever done that we've ever watched. So I know that's an important part of the process, but I saw it firsthand looking up at the river.
Interesting, thank you. From Katie Brokaw, if we do have to do studies to figure out if steelhead are habitating the rising groundwater areas, then it probably isn't significant. From Rachel Lennon, is the habitat in the areas that have been identified as where we have rising groundwater? So is the I guess the designated critical habitat, I think that Director Menningen was talking about, is that where there is rising groundwater? And Director Menningen, please feel free to jump in if I'm capturing that question correctly. From Matt Freeman, the temperature of water being released from the Santa Felicia Dam into Piru Creek is generally much cooler because it is discharged from deeper depths of Lake Piru. So this released water may be more beneficial to aquatic species than currently realized. Okay, so I think that's all the comments that we have related to this topic of GDEs, steelhead, surface water depletion. So let's move on to land subsidence. And again, we can always come back to something if more comments come up. So any comments here on the subsidence criteria? I think this was one where we had a draft last meeting, and in response to some comments that were received, there was an adjustment made to the criteria. And while people are thinking about that, I see one last comment on the GDEs from Kat Selm. GDE communities comprised of willows and cottonwoods require scouring and flood events to disperse as they need the mineral soil to germinate. One concern I have in dead and dying GDEs along the river is that there won't be that seed source to repopulate after a dramatic event like the 2005 floods. Not sure about the longevity of the seed banks for these species. Maybe Bruce can speak to this. I don't know if Bruce, if
Yes.
that's a quick answer, if you want to, okay.
I can give a quick answer. So cottonwoods and willows produce seed that generally is only viable for a few weeks to a month or so. So there's not a long-term storage of seeds in the ground that could persist, for multiple years of drought. So in terms of the recovery process after like a big El Nino flood event like we had in 2005 that wiped out a lot of the riparian vegetation, we need relatively, cottonwoods and willow mature trees fairly nearby to produce the seed to help recolonize. And so that's, I think, Kat's question about longer term dynamics. It's not something we can model quantitatively. So there's the issue of, it is an issue, I think, of interest and concern thinking about longer term dynamics. And if we get more frequent extreme events, droughts and major floods, then what does that do to the natural recovery process? But that's, I think a lot of that is the focus of some of the restoration efforts, more integrated efforts along the river. We've done this on other river systems where you try to restore patches of willows and cottonwoods and native vegetation in areas that are slightly more secure and less likely to be wiped out by the next big flood, so that you do have that local seed source to help promote natural recovery.
But Bruce, wouldn't you think that you'd have a pretty good seed bank, say up Sesame Creek, Pole Creek, Piru Creek, from the base of the dam down to the confluence of the Santa Clara, where pretty significant stands of both cottonwood and willow stay all year long and seem to have stayed put even during the flooding periods?
Yeah, so I think it's, a good point that those would be areas where they tend to persist. And then the question is, a lot of the seed dispersal is by wind. And so there are some colleagues started to study this, but I haven't seen any really definitive studies about just how far that seed can disperse from a patch of mature trees. But it's via wind, but it also can be dispersed via water. So I think your point, in the longer term, definitely you would expect recolonization, from seed sources upstream like that in the tributaries. And what we don't have a good handle is just how fast that would happen.
Well, if it's wind driven, then I can guarantee we're planting willow trees in the Pacific Ocean on the Santa Ana wind event.
Would birds also carry that seed?
There's no studies that I've seen that have documented that for the cottonwoods and willows. They're very fine seeds. They might get small amounts sort of accidentally dispersed, but it is true for certain other riparian species that birds and other wildlife are key dispersal agents.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Willow seeds will germinate any place where there's water, including farmland. You can ask any farmer.
Yeah, so they germinate, and then it's what happens.
They're all over the place, and they certainly take advantage of any irrigation we do. Believe me.
Yep, that's been promoted on other systems of just increasing natural seed germination via essentially irrigation of graded farm fields, or essentially recreating those in the river itself and just providing more significant soil moisture for germination. And then you have to just make sure that moisture level, the capillary fringe zone of the groundwater, declines slowly enough that the roots can start growing and keep up with that once the irrigation's cut off.
Wind dispersed seed species are spreading everywhere all the time and taking root when conditions are correct.
True. So the challenge is I think from the ecological perspective, is just trying to quantify that and get a better handle on, what's the frequency of those germination events and the spatial distribution. So yes, it's beyond the scope, I think, of what SIGWA would consider, but I think it is, we always try to think about trajectories of the ecosystem into the future and what that might do to affect the limiting factors affecting species like steelhead, as well as cottonwoods and willows. So that's part of our science framework and approach.
Thanks, Bruce. And I was wondering, while we have you, is there anything that you wanted to weigh in on or react to in terms of what was being said before about the steelhead habitat?
So, I agree that it would be nice to have a more focused and detailed limiting factors assessment to really, understand what's going on in the system. I think the general assumption by most people is that, at least the main stem, it's primarily fish passage, but there has been a lot of discussion over the last 10, 15 years about that lower East Grove area, and whether there's the main stem that Tony's talked about and persistence of flow, but there's also this apparently spring-fed brook, Lost Creek, it's been called, mainly on Sandy Hedrick's property on the south side. And to my knowledge, there haven't been any detailed studies there of whether, documenting whether it has the potential for steelhead rearing, for example. So that, I think it falls in the category of a data gap that you might want to consider for addressing in the 5-year monitoring period.
Hard to imagine temperature not being a limiting factor there, but
Well, I think that, just some simple temperature data would help put that to rest. And that Lost Creek portion flows through the densely shaded riparian grove. So, it's potential. Some of our colleagues did studies on Santa Paula Creek that found steelhead there were rearing and surviving in the summer at temperatures significantly higher than what you would ascertain from the literature from more northern streams, which is where most of the work has been done. So from the I won't speak to the nexus with Sigma, but from the larger science perspective, I think it's a data gap that could be addressed with some fairly limited and simple studies, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to bring us back to land subsidence now so that we can finish out this portion of the evening. Are there any comments on the revised land subsidence criteria? I'm not seeing any at the moment. So let's put the degraded water quality on the table as well. This one has been pretty consistent over the past few presentations, I believe. Any comments on the water quality? Yeah, Director Mennigan had mentioned something about temperature, possibly. Okay. Any comments about any of the last call on any of the criteria? Yeah, I'm not seeing any. So maybe we can close out the workshop portion and move to the item 3.
I'm sorry, Lisa, I
motion.
think a comment just came in right now to the chat.
Oh, thank you.
No problem.
Yes. From Matt Freeman. Like Director McFadden, I also know firsthand that the winter floods of 04 and 05 were devastating. I have personally participated in agency large-scale required habitat restoration projects, and Mother Nature tends to recover over time. This flooding destroyed more mature cottonwood and willow trees than any drought-based conditions from my personal observations. Thank you. Okay, so let's turn it back over to Chair Long for the rest of the agenda. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
so,
you, everybody, for all your comments.
Yes, thank you very much. And then also, Lisa, if you can put in the chat box, if they have any future information they want to send to us, where would they send that to?
To me,
To
Eva.
Eva Ibarra.
I'll put it in the
Thank
chat.
you.
If you could, that'd be great, because
Okay.
this conversation is still free flowing, even though we'll be closing our workshop. We want to hear from our stakeholders, and we will be having our meeting on April 15th, and we'll be talking about this again. And so the more information and the more we can reach our stakeholders, the better. So thank you very much for all of you to participate in this. And as you can tell, we all don't agree. We all have a lot of good questions, and we want to keep that coming to this board. So I appreciate all the commissioners and everyone speaking. The next item we are moving to now is the motioned item for a sustainable management criteria development. And so, Tony, do you want to run us through this one? Is there
Sure.
what?
So we're in a position here to ask the board to consider the draft matrix that you see here on the screen, and deliberate amongst yourselves and consider for approval those draft criteria as currently worded, or if there are last minute wordsmiths you'd like to make right now that make it more palatable for the board, then we can do those, and you can then deliberate and then hopefully elect to approve those. Our situation is we're getting close to the point of no return for the draft GSP. We need these criteria to be done. We can't wait 30, 60, 90 days anymore. We're out of time. We need to get going with assembling the draft text for the GSP document itself. So time is not our friend anymore.
Thank you.
So whatever the board can do to advance at least some of these would be appreciated.
Would you also, for the stakeholders that are still on, let them know when we started with this matrix? This is not the first time our directors have seen this matrix. How long have we been working on this matrix?
I believe we started working on this matrix in August, September timeframe, correct?
That's about right. Yes. Yes.
I
Which
guess
year?
one thing, Chair Lung, I would add also is many of the things we've talked about during the workshop were uncertainties that we like to address. And that, I guess I would strongly recommend that the uncertainties be moved off into a separate bracket, and we can identify those, we can discuss those, but there's no more time to address uncertainties. So we have to decide with the information we have at this point on the best set of MTs and MOs, and take our best shot and turn our consultant loose to write some draft plans. And then I think just as important is to identify those things that we need to partner with somebody else or do ourselves to identify those data gaps. So just a reminder again, this agency has recognized already that we don't have as good a data on the shallow surface water interactions around some of these areas, and we are proposing a monitoring wells project to do that. And there are other things that I think we could partner with people on to identify some of these other data gaps. But this agency has probably 100 times more data than many of them that are trying to do this same exercise. And so, we shouldn't get paralyzed in trying to have perfect information. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't identify the places we have shortfalls, and we can either choose to take those on or we can try to partner with somebody else. But yeah, I think we have plenty of information to make a good sense judgment call on some of these and turn our consultant loose to start writing these plans, because the consequences of not making a decision are pretty bad for us. So we want to get these done and have time for stakeholders to review the plans. So just wanted to remind everybody to bracket those things that are future studies, and we'll identify those, and we can include those in the plan. Correct, Tony?
That's correct. That's
so
correct.
and we can identify perhaps other management actions that we can explore in the future. So
I appreciate you saying that, because I take it very seriously that we've been working for 8 months on this. And I appreciate Candace and Ed and Gordon working at the subcommittee with Tony to get us started on this. And so we have been deliberating for quite a long time. I agree, nothing is perfect and that this is a working document. I would like to hear from Director Pace or Director Kimball. If you have any input, and then the others as to any questions on this. It again can be changed if we needed to, but I agree we need to move forward.
Well, I have some just general thoughts over some of the things that we've been covering tonight, in no particular order, but I think there's a couple of these, of the 6 that we have in front of us,
I feel like the first two, groundwater elevation, groundwater storage reduction, the last two, degraded water quality, and of course, seawater intrusion is not a no-brainer. It seems like I feel I'm in a position that we could give direction to say, move forward with what's written there. I've had some comments on the side and giving some thought to the land subsidence. And Tony Morgan's probably thinking, what are you talking about, Glenn? This is what we put in what you asked for. So, and I recognize that and completely. There's a little concern on my, just as I've heard from others and thinking about it, is that too tight of a number that we have there? But generally I think we have good information, and there may be just small massaging there, if anything. But I think we could move forward on 4 of these, possibly on the 5th. It does sound like there's a lot more discussion that wants to be had on the surface water depletion. And I just some thoughts there. It feels to me like we don't have enough information, and that we have to describe what we're lacking and how we're going to obtain that. But it also feels to me that, and it could be through my own lack of knowledge, but I feel like we're drifting. I feel like we're being sucked outside of the bounds of our requirement. And maybe for good reasons. We're very passionate about different things and about the GDEs and things. But I feel like, it feels like we're drifting outside of that. And I'm wondering if we're drifting into a territory, we're expecting the GSA to become a university and studies and fund things that are not being funded and studied in other situations. And I don't think that was the intent of the requirement. I worry that we start drifting outside of where the bounds of the rules have been placed on us. Although I completely understand why we would want to go back to 2011, I'm worried about when we go outside the rules that government has set on us, because I'm worried that they set the rules to begin with. And then when we start making them even more stringent, I think that's, we're asking for some potential problems and some unintended consequences. So there's a lot at stake here. I would rather go in with a very well thought out, as much as we can, but understanding we're lacking some information. Let's agree with what we can, but then let's also, if we can, agree to some things that we say, these are lacking information, and this is how we're going to obtain it so that we can get to where we need to be. Time is not on our side, but even if we had more time, I think we will be discussing GDEs for a much longer than 2-3 months. It may be years, and it may be an ongoing process. So it may be a big impact for the next 20 years. I just don't know. So not to ramble on too long, that's just, I think it's important that we don't get outside of our bounds too soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that information. Gordon, Director Kimball.
So like Glenn, I think I'm ready to approve the SMCs for groundwater elevation, groundwater storage reduction, degraded water quality, and obviously seawater intrusion. I see what we asked for, what was delineated in the pumper's letter in the land subsidence, and but I would like to have the opportunity to have a discussion and an evaluation by our consultants on that. Maybe we could schedule that for the board meeting of the 15th. On surface water depletion, we clearly are getting the sense of how big this could be. And I do think that I agree. We have a responsibility to complete this GSP, and we have a responsibility to meet the requirements of DWR in the GSP. However, and one of those is to hear our stakeholders, to listen to them and consider them. Those letters came in time. I caught them in time at 4:30 to go through, to like skim through them, but I haven't had a chance to read them and understand them. And I have a little concern that maybe Candace can give us a sense that those are two groups in her coalition. Are those the only two groups that want to comment? I don't think we can give them weeks and weeks to comment, but I'd like to make sure that we have all the comments in, and I would like time for us and our consultants to consider them and ask questions about them like we did today, only having read them and understood them. And then I'd like to have a chance at a following board meeting to understand what they mean and begin to talk about potential possibilities for SMCs. And I'd like to recommend that we do that not at the board meeting we actually vote to approve those. So I guess I'm asking for 2 or 3 board meetings before we are tasked with approving those on surface water depletion, because clearly this is very complicated and there's a lot of passion. So I don't know how that fits in our schedule, but that's my feeling. I think we owe it to our stakeholders to hear everything they say, everything they have to say. And while it is clearly true that every stakeholder will have a chance to comment on the draft report, everybody who's dealt with government agency knows that by the time you hear this all the time, you have time to comment when it's drafted and it's a draft. And, you know, it's really difficult to incorporate comments. And there's a lot of, nobody feels, or I mean, I think there's a general feeling that it's generally too late. I want within the bounds that Tony Morgan can give us, I want to give the stakeholders an opportunity now while we're making the decisions about what we do and how much we study and what we put into the next 5 years. I want to take every opportunity we can, and if it means meeting every 2 weeks as a board to do that, I think I'm ready to do that. Let's put it that way. So that's enough for me.
Thank you very much. I'll call on Director Milligan. Do you want to make some comments on this one?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Gordon, his willingness to give everybody fair time to provide their input. As much as we have been working on SMCs for 7 to 8 months, pretty much half of that was focused on groundwater elevation and groundwater storage, water quality, and surface water depletion didn't necessarily get as much time focused on it. And for those reasons, I think it's why it's the biggest gray area within the matrix right now. I think in a lot of ways we were pushing the most difficult one off to the end. That said, I have circulated the draft memo with my membership and the relevant resource agencies. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the point person there was out of the office all of last week, and they weren't able to do a comment letter. I know that National Marine Fisheries Service was under the deadline for the surface water groundwater flow model on Ventura River, and that was also a reason why they didn't have the capacity to provide comment for this meeting. So there's definitely room for further input. I would also, like, I'm going to be circulating the letter provided to the Santa Clara River Groundwater Environmental Committee members. for their input and their sign on. I think, as mentioned to Director Villaseñor, I think there are definitely clear metrics that we could discuss now. We've identified some of the data gaps in the letter that Tony's also alluded to. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a difficult discussion. It's really about just hashing it out about what sustainable management criteria we'd be comfortable with. As with regards to degraded water quality, we've said the regulatory authority is the Regional Water Quality Control Board. You know, one of the metrics can be, we want to support the flows that are coming out of Santa Felicia Dam under the FERC license. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just making sure that we're covering the bases that we need to, so that we can say that we aren't having a negative impact on Steelhead as a beneficial user. And as indicated, you know, if we need to do a limiting factors analysis as a data gap, that can be identified as a study that needs to be done, particularly for a GDE for rearing habitat. That said, I do think, as per Tony Morgan's comment about the end of April, that surely should give National Marine Fisheries Service and others an opportunity to weigh in so we can finalize things. And Director Kimball's recommendation that we have a board meeting to hash that out and have that input before we adopt would be helpful. And I'm in agreement that we can adopt 4 of the 6 metrics this evening.
And you have it, okay. So the 2 that you have questions on are the SW depletion and the land subsidence.
Yeah, I'm hearing hesitancy
Just
from Glenn and Gordon about land subsidence. And I think we need more quantitative metrics for surface water depletion.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Director Villaseñor, any comments?
Just listening to all of the fellow directors, that I am happy to go with the board and look at these 4 metrics and make a decision on those today. And as Director Kimball was saying, if we need to meet more, absolutely, you know, in order to have all of our stakeholder input, it's fine with me.
Thank you. And Director McFadden.
I'm in agreement with Director Menigan, Pace, Kimball, and Villaseñor regarding the 4 SMCs that we're in agreement on. And I think we're pretty close on the land subsidence. I think if there was a way to monitor and see actually what's happening over the years, that would give me some more confidence. Definitely think we need more time to talk about surface water depletion. I have not read the letters that were posted at 4:30. I would really like to do that, especially in the context of all the comments that we received. And I would be completely open to having some extra board meetings soon to do that. Part of me doesn't like that because I know that we're paying for staff time, we're paying for everybody's time in extra meetings, and that is a cost to the assessment payers, the people who are actually paying the bills. But I think in this case, we have to do it, and I would support it.
Thank you very much.
I've said I'm going to be out of town for a while, but I will find a way to get on Zoom on vacation if that's what it takes to do it.
Well, thank you for your dedication. I too agree on the 4 items to be accepted today. If anyone was to make a motion, I do agree that we need to hear more from the stakeholders, and I want to make sure that the stakeholders that are here today know that our board has requested this. It's not just one of our board members requesting it. All of us have, to make sure that we hear the stakeholders from all the environmental as well on this GDE. It has been lacking for one reason or another, and to make sure that we hear from everybody, that's part of the push for putting this GSP together. So we will be reviewing all these letters and understanding it. And I think that that's important to make sure that that message is across. So hopefully on the 15th, with all the information that we've gotten, we'll be able to review even more of it. I only mentioned the 8 months because I want to make sure people don't think we just put this together in a month and said, hey, let's go do it. No, it's been very thought-provoking and really good discussions on this, and want to make sure that that's clear. We have had different city council members join us, but overall, it's been a very overwhelming. We want to hear from our stakeholders, and we need everyone represented here. So I want to make sure that that is really heard as we do it. So with this is a motion, and after Tony, so is there any other feedback that you need to discuss with us if we're moving on with the groundwater elevation, groundwater storage reduction, surface water depletion we don't do, land subsidence we don't do, degraded water quality we do, and silt water intrusion we do? Is there anything as a board do we need to know about before we make this motion?
No, that's helpful to get that consensus for those 4 items so we can move forward with drafting some of the language in the GSP. One of the things I will ask any of the reviewers, including the directors, is that when you look at these documents, either tech memos or whatever they are, sections of the GSP, it doesn't matter, is that you look at them with an eye towards a solution. By that, I mean, we see lots of comments in documents, and I have over the years, where people say, I don't agree, or I don't like that conclusion. And that while that's information, it's not particularly helpful information. What we really need from you is to say, I don't agree with that conclusion. Here's why, and here's my recommended approach to fixing that. So that gives us something to go on. So if we think we need a new MT, a new metric for in there, it's okay to say we think we need a new metric, but give us something concrete to look at. I think it should be X, and I think values should be somewhere between Y and Z. It's really helpful to have those kinds of things. And that's kind of, I put that in the category of completing your job as a reviewer. You comment on the technical viability, the strength of the argument, and that kind of thing. And when you find weaknesses, you identify the weakness, and then you say, here's how I would make it better. Here's how I would strengthen that argument. Or here's my alternative approach to that. I don't like the way you did that. I think this is a better way. So those things are immensely helpful, and they will help us because, as I've mentioned before, the calendar is not our friend anymore. So those kinds of things just speed and fuel the discussion forward faster.
Okay, thank you. And it is a big step to even get 4 of these approved. So I just want to say thank you very much, Tony and Tony Emmerich and Dan and everybody putting this together. So with that, yes, please.
Tony, this is Council. I just wanted to confirm with Tony that these SMCs that are, I presume, are about to be moved, they apply to both basins. Is that correct?
Yes.
That is correct.
Okay, because we have a unique voting structure, and I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
That's a really good point. And these would be definitely for both basins.
Thank
So
you.
with that, can I get a motion? Thank you, Stephen.
I'll move for the Fillmore Basin.
Okay.
We
Do you,
approve.
Stephen, do you want us to vote for them separately, or is it okay because these are for both basins? Do you want it together?
I think that it's because it's for both basins, it's okay if you vote on these together. There's
Okay.
not, yeah.
then I would change my motion to, I move that we approve the 4 SMCs as written: the groundwater elevation, groundwater storage reduction, degraded water quality, and seawater intrusion.
I'll
Okay,
second the motion.
it's been first and second, and any further discussion? I would just ask that our next board meeting, April 15th, we'll be discussing the 2 that we have not approved. So Ava, if you could do a roll call, please.
Yes. Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
All right.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
So that motion is a pass. Thank you very much. This is a huge step for our GSP to get that done. I just have to say that's huge. So just even getting 4 of them together is pretty awesome. So thank you.
Unanimously.
Huh?
Unanimously.
Yeah, right? Unanimously. So thank you. And with that, our further discussions will be those other 2. Is there any other items that you would want for our next board meeting?
Chair Long,
Yes.
in regards, this is a question for Tony. In terms of timing, if we accept comments till the end of April, are you expecting that then at the end of April or at the May board meeting that we would approve the SMC for surface water depletion? What I need, because if we get comments through the end of April, I personally need more than a day or a week. I mean, again, I'd like to have another board meeting, at least a board meeting in between receiving the last comments and when we need to commit to SMCs. So the question is, when do you need that SMC approved? I guess.
Everyone.
The totally non-committal answer, as soon as humanly possible, is the answer. I mean, if we get it by mid-May, the approval of the SMCs by mid-May, we will probably end up slipping the draft GSP a bit. I need to look at a calendar and get with staff to see what that does to the timeline. But it will probably slip a little bit. I don't mean slip 3 months. I mean slip, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that.
Tony, what if we asked for all written comments by, say, April 15th or 16th, and we were shooting for adoption, by the end of April or the very beginning of May?
I think that works better. We have other things we can work on in the document between now and then. So if there's still 1 or 2 of them hanging out through the end of April, we're okay with that, I think. If it starts moving over into May, a significant amount of time, then that's when I suggested we might have to talk about schedule adjustment. But that would be a preferred alternative, Tony, if that's possible.
So if we can get the feedback in by the 15th, is that what you're saying?
Correct. That we can advertise, we ask people to respond by the 1st, but we can be pretty tough on drawing a deadline on the 15th or 16th. 15th is a nice even number, and it's essentially a couple extra weeks. So, we've received some significant comment letters. There may be a couple that are out there yet. But if the board is okay with that, we can advertise the 15th as kind of the drop dead date for comments. That would give the board a little bit of time to digest them. And although tight, we could target maybe a first week of May agenda where we adopt the final SMC.
Right, because we have our meeting is on the 15th. Our next
Mhm.
one is May 20th. So in between that would be May 6th. So that is cutting it close, but can we do it? I think we're going to have to try.
It
How about
is,
April
and
29th?
we could shoot for the 29th, or we could, so we have the meeting on the 15th. We could shoot for a special meeting on the 29th.
Yeah, I have another meeting, so I'll have to join you later, but that's okay. You guys can continue.
That's what
This
the
is
other.
important. Well, you know what? I think this is a future agenda item. I think we've gone into information enough. So at the 15th, we need to bring this information so we can discuss the calendar and
Right.
then some dates. How about that?
That sounds good. We'll make sure that there's an item on the agenda for the 15th to consider a special meeting.
Okay. Thank you. I don't want Stephen to buzz me and say I've said too much.
And
Gordon, does that clarify?
Yeah, that's a good plan. I'd be surprised if we can establish and agree SMCs in 2 weeks. But I think we need to, for Tony's sake, we need to try. I also, actually, Tony, again, if you could, you said you have to look at schedule. If you would look at the schedule in time for our next board meeting on the 15th, because I'm not averse to moving the schedule 2 weeks, even if it means there's 2 weeks less for the final draft review. I think this is our opportunity, our most important opportunity, and with the technical memo being so late to frame the discussion, we really are jammed. But I still think we need to give we need to do everything we can, short of Tony walking out on us, to give the stakeholders the opportunity and to include their concerns. So.
Well, and for the 15th, also a comment from Brian Bondi, which is probably something we need to have for the 15th, is suggested concrete proposed for surface water depletion to comment on. He's asking, there is not a concrete proposed for a surface water depletion to comment on. So that perhaps needs to be a goal for the 15th as well. I would agree. So that we could hash it out one way or another. Any other?
I just wanted to clarify, did we change the date of when we want to accept written comments on the technical memo? Earlier in the meeting, we had mentioned April 30th. Are we moving that back to April 15th?
Yes.
And if
Correct me if I'm wrong. Go ahead.
If I could clarify, that's when we would like to have comments in if we want to try to consider them for the public draft. If they come in after that, it doesn't mean we're not going to look at them. It just means they're not going to get considered before the public review draft is prepared.
Right. All right. Any other future agenda items? And seeing none, I'm getting you guys off early at 7:30. Okay, Ed, go for it. I knew we weren't that easy.
No, this will be fast. Are we gonna talk about land subsidence too? Get that knocked out?
Yes.
Okay.
Both of those, thank you for clarification. Both of those will be our discussion for on the 15th.
I'd also like to compliment Director Menigan on having very clear statements and responses while literally juggling family.
She's a true multitasker.
Well, I try.
Yeah.
Hey, we'll take you as much as we can. How about that?
Yeah,
It's a
well,
sweet.
I'm technically still on maternity leave, but this is important to me, and I think it's important for the environmental stakeholders to have a vote, and that's why I'm committed. And thank you for being generous with Isabella crashing the meeting.
He's
It's
welcome
sweet.
anytime.
Wonderful.
Yeah. All right. Well, all of you have a just safe night, and thank you so much for all your input. We will be back on Zoom April 15th at 5 o'clock, and we will see you then. And email Eva if you have any comments. Thank you so
Yes.
much. Eve,
Thanks,
sorry.
everybody. Good night.
Good one. Thank you.
Night.
You got 4, Tony.
Take 4.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Hola. Ya. Déjame no. Oh, espérame.
You all done there, Eva? You muted.